Good day. Today is Tuesday, 19th August 2025, and we are now a few hours away from the meetings in Washington between President Trump of the United States and President Zelensky of Ukraine, and between President Trump of the United States and Zelensky, together with all of the various other European leaders as well. And before I proceed and discuss these rather confusing meetings that took place yesterday, confusing in the sense that they appeared to me, even more than usual, to be ultimately performative rather than substantive, can I just say that the overall result of these meetings, of these discussions in Washington, leave the outcome of the Alaska summit, the meeting that took place between Trump and Putin on Friday, unchanged. The Russians have consistently insisted that there should be progress towards a full, comprehensive settlement of the Ukrainian conflict based on their ideas, which I've described as Istanbul Plus. They have consistently rejected the idea of a ceasefire or of a freeze of the conflict, even on a temporary basis. And President Trump on Friday came round to the Russian point of view and accepted Russian thinking on this question. The result is that he abandoned his plans, his threats to impose massive sanctions and tariffs on both Russia and on Russia's trade partners, as he had been threatening to do over the previous weeks. And nothing that happened yesterday, nothing that was said by any party, by Trump, by Zelensky, by the Europeans, changed that reality. We are now in a situation where the entire objective from this point onwards is to seek a full, comprehensive, negotiated solution of the conflict, what the Russians have been insisting upon all along. I noticed that the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, congratulated Donald Trump on his success in breaking the deadlock. What Mark Rutte, of course, did not acknowledge is that Trump did indeed break the deadlock in all of the discussions by taking the whole question of the ceasefire off the table, at least for the present time. The Europeans, the Ukrainians, have been insisting on a ceasefire, have been insisting in effect on a freeze of the conflict. General Kellogg, Donald Trump's advisor, about whom we have heard virtually nothing over the last couple of days, was the original person to come up with the idea of the ceasefire and the freeze of the conflict. That proposal for a ceasefire and for a freeze of the conflict was what brought the entire negotiating process to the point of deadlock, and Trump has indeed broken the deadlock by dropping that idea. Now, to get a sense of what I mean, just go back to the memoranda that the Russians and the Ukrainians exchanged on the eve of the last meeting that took place in Istanbul a few weeks ago, the third meeting between the Ukrainians and the Russians in Istanbul. The Russians set out their proposals in their memorandum, the proposals which I have described as Istanbul Plus. The Ukrainians set out their ideas, and their ideas were for a ceasefire. Ultimately, the Ukrainians were still seeking demanding, insisting upon a ceasefire. And that was the heart of Ukraine's counter-proposal. The counter-proposal was for a ceasefire. Now, that Ukrainian counter-proposal to the Russian proposal, which is Istanbul Plus, has been taken off the table, not by Zelensky, not by the Ukrainians, over the course of the discussions in Istanbul, but by Donald Trump following his meeting with Putin in Alaska. And to repeat again, Mark Rutte is actually absolutely correct, because it is this idea of a ceasefire that Kellogg came up with in April of last year, and with which Donald Trump has been running ever since, which did in fact cause the deadlock, which has now been broken. Anyway, Rutte, of course, has not said it in this way, but that is the reality. Now, in all other respects, what we got out of the meeting yesterday was performance and noise. Too much performance and too much noise. The Europeans came along demanding security guarantees for Ukraine. Keir Starmer and Macron were again talking about deploying European reassurance forces to Ukraine. There was again a lot of talk about a ceasefire, coming mostly from Merz and Macron. Zelensky went into the meeting apparently intending to push back against proposals supposedly from the Russians that the Ukrainian army withdraw from Donetsk region and that there be a ceasefire. He brought a map with him, which he was apparently intending to show to Trump. In fact, he did show it to Trump. It was in the Oval Office for a time, but it was supposedly going to be the map that was going to explain why the Ukrainians could not pull out from Donbass, and the fact that it's untrue that the Russians are really winning the war. This is what Zelensky has been saying. It's what Macron also said. He said, Macron actually went further. He said it was fake news that the Russians are actually winning the war. Fake news being promoted by Ukrainian commentators and people like that. I'm not going to waste time with what Macron and Zelensky said. But anyway, Zelensky came to the meeting in Washington, presumably expecting a row over demands from Trump that the Ukrainian army withdraw from Donbass in order for there to be a ceasefire. He came, as I said, with a map, intending to push back on that. He was asked to turn up at the White House in a suit and tie, but of course he didn't. He compromised. He turned up in a suit, wearing some kind of t-shirt or shirt of some kind, but I noticed that he didn't come with a tie. But anyway, the great argument about the pullout from Donbass never took place because apparently Donald Trump didn't raise it. He said this was something for the Ukrainians and for the Russians to sort out between them. The reality is, of course, and this is my own belief, but I have no doubt about it, that the Russians never at any time offered a ceasefire in return for a Ukrainian pullout from Donetsk. I think what happened was that the Americans floated this idea. I've noticed that the Russian news agency TASS, without exactly saying so, always reports this proposal for a Ukrainian pullout from Donetsk with a ceasefire in other places. It always reports this as if it was an American proposal, and without making any further comment. And I am sure that that is right. Anyway, the Americans made the proposal. It is not actually correct that Putin made that proposal in Alaska. The proposal came from the Americans. The Russians perhaps said that if the Ukrainians were to make it, they would consider it. The Americans, Trump himself, probably know that they have been over-egging the pudding on this one, that they've given the impression that the Russians have offered or agreed to more than they really have. And that's probably why the Americans didn't bring it up in the meeting with Zelensky. So the result is that the meeting between Trump and Zelensky went off quietly. Zelensky made all his usual points about the Russians. He offered huge amounts of money, which he doesn't have, which the Europeans presumably will give him to buy more American weapons from the Americans, presumably to go on fighting the war, and all of that. He talked about security guarantees, about which more shortly. The Europeans also talked about security guarantees. But the meeting, because there wasn't this epic battle between Zelensky and Trump over territory that many people had anticipated, I thought ultimately it fizzled rather flat, just to say. Anyway, we then did get on to the subject of security guarantees. And here again, Trump was talking very grandly and somewhat all over the place. He said that Ukraine didn't need to fear, that the Russians would indeed attack Ukraine again, that the security for Ukraine would be provided by the United States, by the US military, though he didn't provide any details. He gave all kinds of impressions that security guarantees were indeed on the table from the United States, though I noticed that, as is so often the case with Trump, he never let himself be fully pinned down on this, despite the various attempts by the Europeans, by the Ukrainians, to pin him down. He never set out clearly what security guarantees the United States was in fact minded to give. What he did talk about rather a lot, and what Zelensky, of course, also was talking about rather a lot, is a direct meeting between Zelensky and Putin. The Ukrainians have been plugging this idea. Well, Zelensky has been plugging this idea since May, when when Putin first proposed direct talks between Russia and Ukraine. Zelensky initially rejected that proposal. He said that there could be no direct negotiations with the Russians unless there was a ceasefire. Trump then said that there should be direct negotiations with the Russians. Putin appointed a negotiating team in May. This is all in May, which went to Istanbul to meet the Ukrainians. Zelensky initially said that he would not send negotiators to Istanbul. He said that he would go himself to meet the Russians and expected Putin to be there. Putin made it very clear that he was not going to be there. Zelensky said that he would go and meet the Russians even if Putin himself was not there. He then flew to Ankara, which is of course also in Turkey, but he didn't go to Istanbul. He got involved in a long conversation with Erdogan, who eventually made him to understand that the Americans absolutely were insisting that he appoint a negotiating team and send that negotiating team to Istanbul, and that he himself should not go. But ever since then, Zelensky has continued to push this idea of a bilateral meeting between Putin and himself, Why he thinks that this will somehow solve the entire crisis, I'm not clear. The Russians, for their part, have said that they're not opposed, in principle, to a meeting between Putin and Zelensky, even though they do not consider Zelensky to be the legitimate president of Ukraine. They accept him as the de facto authority in the country, and therefore the party they must negotiate with at the present time. But they don't think that a meeting with Zelensky, until the point has been reached when a proper framework for a peace agreement has been arrived at, would make much sense. And that has been the Russian position up to this time. Now, over the course of the meeting yesterday, Trump, who seemed to be, I thought, in a very changeable mood. At times he looked slightly depressed, or at least that was my impression. At other times he looked euphoric. Anyway, at one point he cut off the meeting. He said that he didn't have time to speak to the Ukrainians or to the Europeans who were there. He needed to speak to Putin himself. And quite clearly, what he was hoping to do was talk to Putin, get Putin to agree to this bilateral summit meeting with Zelensky. Trump perhaps was expecting that he himself would be there too. There's been reports in the media in the United States floating around that Trump wants the meeting to take place between Putin and Zelensky on Friday the 22nd of this month, or at least to take place this month. That Trump himself wants, obviously, to be at the meeting. Anyway, he dashed off to try to get this meeting agreed with Putin. That's my own assessment. And I suspect that he was hoping to give substance to the meeting by returning from the telephone call with Putin and announcing that Putin had agreed to the meeting and that the meeting would indeed take place on Friday, the 22nd of August, and that Trump himself would attend. That's what I think the purpose of the call to Putin was all about. Now, as my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou has said on a live stream that we did together, and by the way, also in a private conversation, actually this was extremely bad diplomatic practice on Donald Trump's part. First of all, it doesn't make sense to cut off a meeting in that way, and in order to report to another party about what has happened at the meeting before the meeting itself is over. I would add that at a certain level, doing something like this, leaving the Europeans and the Ukrainians hanging around whilst dashing off to call Putin, was frankly insulting to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians, or at least could have come across in that way. I don't think it was Trump's intention to be rude in that way, but inevitably the impression must have been given, certainly to the Europeans and probably to Zelensky, that for Trump the real discussions are with Putin, not with the Europeans and the Ukrainians that he was talking to, that the real person whose personality looms over the summit is Putin himself, which is true, by the way, and that Trump therefore felt that it was much more meaningful to be talking to Putin than it was to any of the people in the room. Now, as I said, I think that is true. I think Putin's presence did loom or overshadow the summit. But I don't think it was good diplomacy to make that point quite as obvious as Trump did. And besides, anyway, I think that calling Putin whilst interrupting the meeting meant that Putin was given a rundown of the meeting before the meeting itself had concluded. And that might have created circumstances in which things might have been discussed at the meeting after Trump spoke to Putin, which would have meant that Trump would not have briefed Putin about them. So, as I said, I don't think that was a good diplomatic practice. But anyway, there it is. For the record, as I said, I don't think Trump meant to be rude to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians. But the impression that he considers the dialogue with Putin more important than the dialogue with the Ukrainians and with the Europeans, I think that impression is actually true. I think that in Trump's mind, a conversation with Putin has value far greater than any number of conversations with Zelensky, Merz, Macron, Ursula, Starmer, or all of the others. My colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou, has taken to calling the Europeans Zelensky and co. And I think he's basically got it right. And I think deep down, that's what Trump thinks also. Now, I could be wrong. I could be wrong about this, by the way. It may be that Trump did indeed intend to make it clear to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians who he thought really did matter. But I'm not going to discuss this point further. I think I made my own views about it clear. Anyway, as we will see, Vladimir Putin did not give Donald Trump what he wanted. He did not agree to a three-party meeting between himself, Trump, and Zelensky, or even to a bilateral meeting between himself and Zelensky. Putin is thinking about things in a completely different way from the one that the Europeans and the Ukrainians are following. And that perhaps brings me to the two posts, the two readouts, if you like, that matter. Because, of course, the Russians have now provided their own account of the telephone call between Putin and Trump, and it has been provided again by Yuri Ushakov, Putin's foreign policy aide, the man who is clearly fulfilling the role of Putin's major foreign policy advisor. And Ushakov, of course, would have been in on the call. I noticed that it took some hours before the Kremlin provided the account of what Ushakov was saying. Ushakov himself delayed by several hours speaking to the Russian media, which tells me that Ushakov's statement was crafted after careful discussion with Putin himself and probably with other Russian officials who would, of course, have been in on the call. Anyway, this is what Ushakov said. Colleagues, a half hour ago, Vladimir Putin had a telephone conversation with Donald Trump at the US president's initiative. The president of Russia expressed his heartfelt gratitude to his US colleague for the hospitality and perfect arrangements at the Alaska summit, as well as for the progress they were able to achieve towards bringing about a peaceful resolution to the Ukraine crisis. The President of the United States informed his Russian counterpart about the talks he had just concluded. In fact, as I said, he didn't, concluded at the White House with Vladimir Zelensky and leaders of several European countries. Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump then reaffirmed their commitment to continuing direct talks between the Russian and Ukrainian delegations. Now we're entering into important territory, because what Ushakov is talking about here, and what Putin apparently talked about with Trump when Trump brought up the topic of a meeting between Putin and Zelensky, is that in fact negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians are already taking place. These are the existing negotiations, the ones that started in May in the rather chaotic circumstances that I discussed a few minutes ago, the meetings that are taking place in Istanbul, the meetings where there of which in fact there have been 3, where the Russian delegation is headed by Vladimir Medinsky, and the Ukrainian delegation is headed by Rustem Umerov. And Putin clearly said to Trump, why are we talking about trilateral summit meetings at this time? We already have ongoing negotiations between the Russians, between us, the Russians, and the Ukrainians. And isn't that the format we should stick to? And isn't it best to stick with that format? And through that format, now that we have reached the agreement that we should work towards a full settlement of the conflict, that we should work with and seek to advance. And here I am going to repeat a point I have already made, which is that in my opinion, the entirety of the understanding, the entirety of the agreement that Putin and Trump reached in Alaska was that the way forward to end the conflict in Ukraine would be through negotiating a final agreement, a comprehensive agreement, a full peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine, that the idea of the ceasefire has been dropped. And Putin is saying, well, we agreed in Alaska that we're not going to waste time talking about ceasefires, so let's move forward with those negotiations in Istanbul, where we're meeting with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have made their proposals, but we have made ours. Our proposals are well known. They are Istanbul plus. The Ukrainian proposal is a ceasefire, and that proposal has now been taken off the table. It's been taken off the table by you. And Zelensky, apparently, you've met with him in Washington, and he's not pushing back on this. So the way forward, therefore, is for us to resume the discussions in Istanbul, those conducted by Medinsky and Umerov, and see whether we can move forward now that this issue of the ceasefire has been taken off the table. Let's see what the Ukrainians are prepared to come up with in response to the proposals for Istanbul Plus, which we have made. And then you can see what happened next from the next paragraph. In connection, this is the next paragraph of Ushakov's report. In this connection, among other things, Putin and Trump discussed the prospect of exploring opportunities for drawing higher-ranking officials from both Ukraine and Russia into these direct talks. And you can see, you can almost get a sense of the to and fro during the conversation. Trump says, okay, I understand what you've just said. Istanbul remains the format. Mercouris and Medinsky, however, why do we need to stick with those? Why don't you go to Istanbul and head the Russian delegation? And Zelensky can come to Istanbul too and head the Ukrainian delegation. And Putin pushes back and says, well, hold on a minute. Is this really the right way? And there's all sorts of going backwards and forwards about this. And Putin comes back and says, well, look, maybe you've got something, you're making a certain point now. Maybe we do need, now that the Ukrainians have come off this impossible stance that they had of demanding only a ceasefire, maybe the moment has come for us to engage in substantive discussions at a higher level. I am not sure, though, whether it's really appropriate for me to act as my country's chief negotiator and for Zelensky to act as Ukraine's chief negotiator. But let's explore the possibilities of higher-ranking officials attending the meetings in Istanbul. It might be Lavrov, for example, on our side, or Belousov, the foreign or defense ministers. Let's talk about this and see whether we can move forward with this idea. And ultimately, and of course, if we move forward and we start getting progress or the appearance of progress in the discussions, as Putin have said many times, I don't object to a meeting with Zelensky. We can perhaps meet in Istanbul to iron out the last details with each other. I, as my country's chief negotiator, head of my negotiating team. Zelensky maybe as Ukraine's chief negotiator, heading Ukraine's negotiating team. Though I still have serious doubts about Zelensky's legitimacy, and if it comes to signing any final agreement, well, it will either have to be signed by the head of the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, or perhaps there will need to be new elections in Ukraine. Well, I'm sure that Putin didn't say all of those things, but one can imagine that a lot of them would have been there at the back of Putin's mind, even as he said to Trump, well, let us indeed explore the opportunities for drawing higher ranking officials from both Ukraine and Russia into these direct talks, the ones in Istanbul. Now, I think it is quite likely that before long we are going to have a meeting in Istanbul in which Putin turns up and Zelensky turns up, and it's done within the format of the ongoing Istanbul negotiations. I think that the Russians are probably willing to go along with this. The major breakthrough in terms of negotiations has actually taken place. The Ukrainians, for the moment, are going along with this point that the negotiations should be about substantive peace negotiations, no longer just about a ceasefire. If Zelensky makes proposals, then it's perhaps proposals on the substantive issues, then it perhaps makes sense for Putin to meet with him. It's not unusual for this to happen, that there should be a meeting between the two leaders with their delegations, that they exchange ideas, then the meetings break up, and then perhaps the negotiations continue to be conducted at a lower level, and then there's another summit meeting, or at least a proper meeting later, at which the remaining points are agreed or sorted out between the leaders. It's not impossible. But of course, this is not, I think, the kind of summit meeting, the bilateral summit meeting that Zelensky and the Ukrainians have in mind, and which they believe that Trump is committed to. Apparently, the Europeans are already going around talking about the venue of this meeting. Meloni wants to have the meeting in Rome between Putin and Zelensky. Others are saying Geneva. I'm not sure that the Russians have any such ideas. If one takes this commentary from Ushakov, it looks to me as if the Russians envisage the meeting as taking place in Istanbul as part of the ongoing talks, the ongoing process of talks. And I suspect that not for the first time, Trump is saying one thing to the Russians and something rather different to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians. They're not exactly in contradiction with each other, but neither are they exactly the same thing. And I'm afraid that misunderstandings and disappointments as a result of this approach are all but inevitable. I'm going to come to all of that. I'm going to come to that shortly. Anyway, Ushakov then had more to say about the tone of the meeting. He said, "It is quite telling that Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump agreed to keep in touch with one another on the Ukrainian issue and other urgent international and bilateral matters." Why is it telling? Well, what it tells me is that in practice, a back channel has been created. The talks will, from this point on, continue to be nominally between the Ukrainians and the Russians. We will have further meetings in Istanbul, which might eventually involve Putin and Zelensky himself. But the real discussions, as we saw in Alaska, will be between the Americans and the Russians. And just as it was the Americans and the Russians who met in Alaska and took the issue of a ceasefire off the table, the ceasefire which Zelensky and the Ukrainians have hidden behind, so I think the Russians expect further on in the negotiations, the Americans to do the same about other issues. So if Zelensky continues to insist that NATO membership for Ukraine must be on the table, it will be up to Putin and Trump to talk about that matter between each other and to come to an agreement with each other, a formal or semi-formal agreement, like the one that they reached about a ceasefire in Alaska. That NATO membership for Ukraine is emphatically off the table. Now, this takes me back to what actually happened in Minsk in February 2015. I don't want to talk here about the actual contents of the Minsk agreement of that time, which of course was never implemented. The key point is that the Minsk agreement reflected Russian thinking about how to settle the conflict at that time. It called for direct negotiations between the Ukrainians and the leaders of the Donbass. It called for a ceasefire, for Ukrainian pullback from the front lines, for autonomy to be granted to Donbass, for all sorts of things. That was, as I said, Russian thinking at the time, and of course the Ukrainians subsequently never complied with it, and it was never brought to fruition. But the point is that this was Russian ideas at the time, And it was absolutely not something that the Ukrainians at that time wanted to do. President Poroshenko of Ukraine, as I remember, for many hours declined to endorse the Minsk agreement. He refused to let his representative, the former Ukrainian president Leonid Kuchma, sign it. He refused to sign the accompanying leaders document, which committed the various leaders of all of the various countries, Germany, France, Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, to see the Minsk agreement implemented. And Putin, who had by this point reached an understanding with Merkel, left it to Merkel and Hollande basically to bully Poroshenko into getting him to put his signature to the Minsk not to the Minsk agreement itself, to the leaders' declaration, and to get his representative Kuchma to sign the Minsk agreement itself. And I suspect that the Russians are expecting that eventually something rather similar will happen. That along the way, as the Russians make further demands of the Ukrainians in conformity with Istanbul Plus, the Ukrainians will resist, but the Russians, talking to Trump, talking to the Americans, will get the Americans to put overwhelming pressure on the Ukrainians to agree, so that eventually, step by step, the Ukrainians make the concessions that will lead to the final agreement, which I think the Russians believe will be very much on the lines of Istanbul Plus. So that is why it is quite telling that Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump agreed to keep in touch with one another on the Ukrainian issue. The Russians expect to use the Americans, even as the Americans believe that they can put pressure on the Russians. And then we are told that the conversation was quite frank and constructive. These are somewhat, if I may say, less than fulsome words. They don't suggest a row or anything of that kind. They suggest some positivity between the Americans and the Russians, between Putin and Trump, but they do allow for disagreement on some issues and for Putin to have pushed back on some of Trump's demands. And we can see that Ushakov's comments, taken as a whole, make it fairly clear what those disagreements were. So, we now come to Trump's own account, not of the conversation with Putin. Interestingly, he's not given a detailed account of the conversation with Putin, but he has summed up what happened yesterday in a very interesting Truth Social post. And I'm now going to read it in full. He said, "I had a very good meeting with distinguished guests, President Zelensky of Ukraine, President Macron of France, and other leaders." He says that, as I said, he had, as I said, this very successful meeting with them. President Stubb of Finland, Prime Minister Meloni of Italy, Prime Minister Starmer of Great Britain, Chancellor Merz of Germany, President of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen, Secretary General of NATO Mark Rutte in the White House. Notice that one person who isn't there is Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister of Poland. Many had expected that he would be there. There's a long article about his absence in the Financial Times talking about how Tusk's position in Poland is gradually collapsing, that he's disappointed many of the people who elected him, who feel that he's not achieving what they expected that he would do, in all which makes Tusk's position in Poland sound to me very similar to that of Merz, Macron, and Starmer in Germany, France, and and Britain as well. Anyway, I'm not going to get into discussions about all of that. And then Trump goes on to say, during the meeting, we discussed security guarantees for Ukraine, which guarantees would be provided by the various European countries with a coordination with the United States of America. Now, this is all very interesting because let's just unpack that. The guarantees would be provided by various European countries. This doesn't say that the United States is going to provide security guarantees to Ukraine. It says with a coordination with the United States of America. In the past, Donald Trump has consistently refused to provide Ukraine with security guarantees. The reason for the major argument, the quarrel in the Oval Office between Trump and Zelensky back in February was that Trump refused to give Ukraine security guarantees in return for Ukraine agreeing to a ceasefire and agreeing to sign the mineral rights extraction deal. Zelensky went into the meeting in February expecting that in return for the mineral rights extraction deal and the ceasefire, which up to then he had resisted, but which he had eventually and very grudgingly come round to, Trump would agree to provide Ukraine with a security guarantee. Trump said no, and the whole meeting started to go badly wrong from that moment. Now, Trump spent the entire meeting yesterday with the Europeans and with Zelensky and all previous meetings up till that time, seeming to give the impression that this time he was going to agree to provide Ukraine with security guarantees. I suspect that he did that because he didn't want another explosion from Zelensky like the one that took place in the White House in February. He wanted Zelensky to accept that there would not be a ceasefire, and so he strung Zelensky along by allowing Zelensky to come away with the idea that the United States was indeed thinking about giving Ukraine security guarantees. But when the moment came, after the meeting was over, after Zelensky had gone away, but had apparently accepted that there would be no ceasefire, just negotiations to achieve a final settlement, Trump quietly pulled the rug about security guarantees away from under Zelensky's feet. So now it is no longer the case that the United States is going to provide Ukraine with security guarantees. The European countries will provide Ukraine with the security guarantees. The only role the United States is going to have is that it's going to coordinate somehow with the Europeans providing Ukraine with security guarantees. It looks cynical and manipulative because I suspect it is. It's just possible that Putin also brought up the question over the course of the discussion, the telephone call with Trump. What is all this I'm hearing about you giving Ukraine security guarantees and giving the impression to everybody that I agreed in Alaska that the United States should be giving Article 5 type security guarantees to Ukraine. All we talked about, as I made clear in my press conference, was that there should be arrangements to safeguard Ukraine's future security. I never agreed to anything like Article 5 security guarantees. And Trump, faced by that, might have used this Truth Social post to make clear that, in fact, the United States is not currently in the business of providing security guarantees to Ukraine. But I think, on balance, it was not pushback from Putin that explains the wording of this Truth Social post. Rather, as I said, it was rather manipulative behavior by Donald Trump. Anyway, let's continue. Everyone is very happy about the possibility of peace for Russia-Ukraine. At the conclusion of the meetings, I called President Putin and began the arrangements for a meeting at a location to be determined between President Putin and President Trump. After that meeting takes place, we will have a trilat, which would be the two presidents plus myself. Again, this was a very good early step for a war that has been going on for almost 4 years. Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff are coordinating with Russia and Ukraine. Thank you for your attention to this matter. So again, the language is really very convoluted. So there's been no agreement for a meeting between Putin and Zelensky. Putin has not agreed to it, but he says, I called Putin and began the arrangements for a meeting. He doesn't say that Putin has agreed to one at a location to be determined. Well, as I said, the Russians clearly envisage that it will be Istanbul, between President Putin and President Zelensky. After that meeting takes place, we will have a trilat, which would be the two presidents plus myself. Again, this was a very good early step for a war that has been going on for almost 4 years. And here we have an admission from Trump that all of the things that have happened over the last week do not mean that the war is going to end tomorrow or in a week's time or in 2 weeks' time. We are at the stage when serious negotiations might finally begin between the between the Russians and the Ukrainians. That process may take a while. There could be meetings along the way between Putin and Zelensky. The Russians insist via the Istanbul format. Who knows? We'll see how that plays out. Eventually, however, we will achieve a peace, or at least that is what Trump hopes. Again, we see how Trump saying one thing to Putin and a slightly different thing, or rather a rather different thing, to Zelensky and the Europeans about this idea of a trilateral meeting or a meeting between Putin and Trump, between Putin and Zelensky, is having to balance out the different things that he's saying to the different parties over the course of this Truth Social post. And in the meantime, it's going to be left to Vance, Rubio and Witkoff to try to sort it out, to thread the needle, to try to bring everybody together in the way that each side wants, to try to reconcile the different stances that the Russians, the different approach that the Russians and the Ukrainians have about the way forward. I'm going to say something here. Trump probably is telling himself that engaging in this somewhat manipulative behavior, using this kind of manipulative language, is what was needed to break the deadlock and to get this process going. And that is a point of view, and it's one that I can understand. Speaking as somebody who has conducted mediations myself, I don't personally agree. I think that a better approach would have been for Trump to have been completely straightforward with the Ukrainians and with the Europeans, and to have left no room for ambiguity whatsoever. What you should have told to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans is something very simple. Putin and I have agreed that this conflict must end through direct negotiations, leading to a complete settlement of the conflict. Ceasefires, ideas about ceasefires, are unhelpful and must be dropped. The Russians are not interested in them. The Russians are not keen on some of your ideas about security guarantees. We'll come to all of that in a moment. And as for security guarantees by the United States, just forget it. It's not coming. We are not going to give Ukraine the sort of security guarantees that you people are talking about. If you want to avoid military defeat in Ukraine, if you want to ensure Ukraine's survival, you will engage in negotiations with the Russians. With these facts in mind, these kind of attempts to weave the United States into giving Ukraine security guarantees, to trying to pull Ukraine into NATO, to try to get ceasefires and freezes of the conflict by another name, simply aren't going to work. Now, I say that is my experience. I can understand why Trump might have said to himself, if I take that approach, we'll have another explosion, from another tantrum from Zelensky, and it's likely that the whole process will collapse before it even begins. But I'm not sure that tantrum hasn't been deferred to a later date, and that it isn't going to come anyway. And in the meantime, I think that the risk that Trump is running is that by taking this approach, which he probably considers diplomatic, but which I consider manipulative, he is tarnishing his position as a mediator, which, as many people are pointing out, in threads on these, and including on these videos, is a bizarre position for him to be in anyway, given that it is the United States which has been arming one of the parties to the conflict, which is, of course, Ukraine. Anyway, there it is. That's what I think. It is what it is. We have what we have. This is the approach that Trump is taking. I've expressed my view. Others may disagree with it. I'm sure Trump himself would disagree with it. I think he's only making trouble for himself further down the line, but we will see where this goes. Anyway, there it is. So what's probably going to happen over the next couple of days is that Vance and Witkoff and Rubio are going to have conversations with the Russians. And I predict that before long, we're going to have a meeting between Rubio and Lavrov, and probably there's already been the first moves towards having that, because the Russians have already been speaking, and the Russian who has been speaking most is indeed Lavrov himself. Now, we'll come on to Lavrov, but first of all, I should say that yesterday, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman, again made it absolutely clear that Russia does not accept the deployment of peacekeepers from any NATO state in Ukraine. The Europeans have been floating that possibility over the last couple of days. Again, the Russians have again said that this is, as far as they're concerned, absolutely out of the question, that if the Europeans persist with this, it is a deal breaker. In fact, the Foreign Ministry spokesman warned the British specifically that if they persisted with this idea, then the Russians would consider the British to be responsible ultimately for the breakdown of any negotiations, assuming, of course, that this proposal is taken forward in any way. The Russians have also, as I said already, made it very clear, I discussed this in my program yesterday, that when it comes to security guarantees, they have to be involved in any discussion of those security guarantees. The reports say that the Europeans are now going to start talking with each other about the format of the security guarantees. But the reality is that what the Europeans negotiate about security guarantees with each other is irrelevant, because, as I explained in my program yesterday, the Russians have a veto over the whole topic. Ultimately, the only security guarantees that can be provided to Ukraine have to be the ones that the Russians agree to, because the Europeans, and by the way, the Americans, have already shown that they are not prepared to fight Russia in Ukraine. That's why the conflict, which has now been going on for more than 3.5 years, has played out in the way that it has done. So the Russians made all of that clear yesterday. Now, Lavrov, having said all of this, has indeed been speaking, and he's said a number of very interesting things. He said that for the Russians, the most important thing in this conflict is the protection of Russians in the territory of what was previously Ukraine. His words, in fact, were as follows. He said what was the protection of Russians in what was formerly Ukraine, and security for Russia as a country as well. And this is what he said. I'm taking all of this from TASS. We don't yet have, unfortunately, a transcript of his words from the Russian Foreign Ministry website. President Trump and his team have more embraced the need to remove the root causes behind this crisis, something we and President Putin have always insisted on, particularly since the Alaska meeting. One root cause is Russia's security concerns, given blatant and systematic violations over decades of promises not to expand NATO eastward. President Putin has repeatedly highlighted that after these assurances, NATO underwent 5 waves of expansion. So, security for Russia, no NATO, or NATO, a Trojan horse for NATO, close to its territory, That is for the Russians a key condition to any agreement, any final agreement to end the war. It is the most important root cause of all. It must be addressed in order that there should be a final settlement of the conflict. And then he talked about the territorial issue, because the way in which, and I think the Russians are concerned and angry about this, the way in which the whole discussion has taken place in the West over the last week has been about territory in a way that gives the impression that the whole special military operation has been some kind of land grab by Russia in eastern Ukraine. And for the Russians, and the Russians have said this many times, it is not a land grab at all. Firstly, it is protecting Russian security. They made it very clear that Ukraine cannot join NATO. This is an absolute red line. Lavrov has again reaffirmed it. It was the violation of that red line, NATO's ultimate promise to Ukraine at the Bucharest summit in 2008 that one day it would join NATO. That was the proximate cause of the war. And that issue has to be resolved once and for all. But the other issue, the other key issue for the Russians is not territory, is not where Russia's borders are. It is the rights and protections of Russians. We never spoke about seizing any territories, neither Crimea, nor Donbass, nor Novorossiya as territories have ever been our goal. Our goal is to protect our people, the Russian people, who have lived on these lands for centuries, who discovered these lands, shed their blood for them, both in Crimea and in Donbass, who founded cities, Odessa, Nikolaev, and many others, as well as ports, plants, and factories. If Vladimir Zelensky is serious about Ukraine upholding its constitution, he should start with the document's first articles, which guarantee the rights of Russian-speaking people. Paradoxically, although laws banning the Russian language in various spheres have been enacted, the Ukrainian constitution still obliges the Ukrainian state to protect fully the rights of Russians and other national minorities. If Zelensky really cares about his constitution, then he should start with its first articles where this obligation is enshrined. Under Zelensky, the rights of Russian speakers have been eliminated. Review their sentiments over the years, you will find no mention of human rights, the total ban on the Russian language in all aspects of life should have outraged the champions of democracy in the West, yet it has not. No one is troubled that Ukraine is the only country in the world to outlaw a language. So what Lavrov is saying is, look, we have our constitution. We take our constitution seriously, unlike the Ukrainians. The 4 regions, we all know about that. But it's not just a question of territory. It never has been a question of territory. First and foremost, it is about Russian security, about the eastward expansion of NATO and its entire infrastructure, its deployment of its forces, Ukraine, its establishment of missile bases and all of that stuff that they've been talking about in the past. That's one core issue. The other core issue is that Ukraine has acted in ways that discriminate against Russians, that seek to suppress the Russian language and Russian national rights. That is why Crimea broke away. That is why there was an uprising in Donbass in 2014. That is why the people in Novorossiya, in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, voted to join Russia. And of course, all of these restrictions, all these discriminatory practices continue in the rest of Ukraine, even in places in Ukraine which historically and culturally continue to be Russian. And note the careful way in which Lavrov talks about Odessa and Nikolaev. So I'm going to suggest that when the meetings begin, when the serious negotiations begin, the Russians are going to bring up not just the question of Zelensky's non-compliance with his own constitution, which he's been talking so much about recently, his non-compliance in terms of his own status. I'm not going to enter into that debate again. His own non-compliance with the rights of Russians, which are enshrined in the terms of his own constitution. But I suspect that the Russians, over the course of the negotiations, are eventually going to bring up the subject of federalization of Ukraine. This has been mentioned by my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. I believe he is right. We've done a program about this on the Duran. I mentioned in that program that back in 2014, Lavrov himself met with the then US Secretary of State, John Kerry, in London, and they issued a statement together in which they supported federalization for Ukraine, issued a statement together in which they supported the federalization of Ukraine. In other words, the reorganization of Ukraine into a federal state in which the various regions of Ukraine would have specific rights to their own languages and high levels of domestic autonomy, which of course, if it applied to a region like Odessa's, would almost inevitably lead to a much closer attachment of that region to Russia. Just saying. And I have to say, reading these comments of Lavrov, I cannot see them as anything else than an indicator that the Russians have these ideas again in mind. Now, it is important to say that without a ceasefire, without an end to the conflict, the Russians are in a position of enormous strength. The Russian army continues to advance in Donbass. I will touch on this briefly in a moment. The threat of sanctions and tariffs against Russia, whilst it has not gone away entirely, it's still there in the background. Merz tried to bring it up again yesterday, but Trump gave the idea short shrift. Anyway, the idea of sanctions and tariffs against Russia, further sanctions and tariffs against Russia, clearly is unpopular with Trump himself and with other officials in the Trump administration, because they realize it won't work and they understand the negative effects it might have for the economy of the United States and for the collective West in general. So, given that this is so, it is the Russians who have the advantage in negotiations. They can always stonewall until the Ukrainians, or perhaps I should say the Americans, who don't want to see a complete collapse in Ukraine, finally come round to their point of view. The Americans have just done that on the question of a ceasefire, after all, and over time, as the negotiations proceed, it is likely that they will do so over more and more issues also. And of course, the Ukrainians will object. They will object furiously. Zelensky will be very angry. The Europeans will be very unhappy. But ultimately, in terms of the Ukrainians and the Europeans, they cannot do anything without the United States. It's become absolutely clear over the last 3.5 years that without the United States, Ukraine will not just lose, but will lose very fast. Why else, for example, engage in all of these elaborate attempts to try to get the Americans to give Ukraine some kind of security guarantee if you don't need the Americans? So that puts the Russians in an advantage. The Americans don't want to see Ukraine collapse. They don't have the means to prevent Ukraine's collapse if the war goes on. They are committed to a negotiating process. As I said earlier in the program, I can quite easily see how the Russian approach, make demands, and then wait for the Americans to put pressure on the Ukrainians to accept them, how that will play out. Isn't that exactly what happened in February 2015 in Minsk? The Ukrainian army was surrounded in Debaltsevo. It looked as if Ukraine was about to suffer a catastrophic military defeat. Merkel wanted to avoid that at all costs, so she put pressure on Poroshenko, the then Ukrainian president, to concede things which Poroshenko never wanted to concede to. And we can see how this is now going to play out over the course of these negotiations, though on a much grander and bigger scale. So, quite probably, quite plausibly, we will have some kind of arrangements where Ukraine does get security guarantees, but so does Russia. Ukraine is excluded from NATO. There will be no NATO troops on Ukrainian territory, and Ukraine itself could quite plausibly be federalized. I am not predicting this outcome because in a complex negotiation like the one we're likely to see, any outcome, including a total failure, is possible. But if this is the Russian game plan, if this is the end point that the Russians envisage, it would not surprise me. Now, of course, what gives the Russians the advantage is that they are winning the war. Now, as I said earlier in the program, Zelensky and Macron went to extravagant lengths to deny this reality. And one of the reasons why Zelensky rushed 6 brigades or elements of 6 brigades to the Pokrovsk area to try to contain the Russian breakthrough there was precisely because he could not afford a collapse in Pokrovsk. That would destroy his claim that Ukraine is actually doing okay in the war. The reality is that Ukraine is not doing okay in the war. It is losing all the time. Now, we've had a lot of more information over the last couple of hours from the area of Pokrovsk, and I think it is now become increasingly clear. There was a long piece about this, by the way, yesterday, again in Redovka, that the Ukrainian claims that they have stabilized the situation in the area is only very, very partially true. The Ukrainians have recaptured, Zoloty, the village of Zoloty Kolodies. The Russians, however, claim that they are Kolodias, that they are surrounded there. The Russians say that they have captured Kucherev Yar, and there is now evidence that the Russians are continuing their advances in the Popiv Yar, Poltavka, Rusin Yar area, and that they're gradually moving towards capturing the important villages of Volodymyrivka, Shahove, and Toretskoye, which would thicken out further the breakthrough area and make this wedge that the Russians have made into the Ukrainian defense positions thicker and wider and stronger, and ultimately more dangerous for Ukraine. It looks as if the Russians have indeed captured this village of Kucherev Yar, though there's no yet definite confirmation of this. About what is going on in Pokrovsk itself, there is little information, but my understanding is that the Russians, contrary to the Ukrainian claims, are indeed still positioned in the central area of Pokrovsk. So anyway, that's Pokrovsk. In order to try to stabilize the situation in Pokrovsk, or at least to give the appearance that the situation in Pokrovsk has been stabilized, the Ukrainians, however, pulled troops back from Konstantinovka, the big town to the east of Pokrovsk, the southernmost town of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk-Konstantinovka conurbation. And of course the Russians seized the advantage that gave them, and it seems that they have now indeed broken into Konstantinovka. They've apparently advanced from the village of Predtechinye, which is located immediately to the east of Konstantinovka. They've advanced all the way into Konstantinovka. They've established a foothold in the eastern suburbs of Konstantinovka, and that has, by the way, in effect, cut off further Ukrainian troops south of Konstantinovka in places like Ivanopilia and other villages to the north of the Klibanbek reservoir, which I suspect by now is almost completely under Russian control. If the Russians capture these villages, Volodymyrovka, Shakhovye, Toretske, to the east of Kucherev Yar and Zoloty Kolodias that I was talking about, then the Russians will indeed be in a position to threaten the town of Druzhivka and cut the supply roads between Konstantinovka and Kramatorsk, and we could have a massive double encirclement operation with the Russians encircling both Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka, which would create a massive crisis for the Ukrainian army, and these possibilities are very real. In the meantime, the Ukrainians continue to suffer very, very heavy losses on the battlefields. I discussed in a program I did a few days ago how the Russians have created in the Pokrovsk area what is in effect another meat grinder, that the Ukrainians continue to suck in troops into Pokrovsk and into the various areas around this, which makes them targets for the Russian Air Force and the Russian drone operators, the Rubicon drone operators, and the Russian artillery, and the Russian light infantry and special forces that are now dispersed across this entire territory, conducting ambushes and things of that kind. Now, there's been apparently further news about further Russian advances in Zaporozhye region, in the Kupiansk area. There's a report today in TASS about how the Ukrainian forces in Kupiansk are surrounded and how the fortified nature of some of the Ukrainian positions in Kupiansk make it unwise for the Russians to launch a frontal attack on them, which is why the Russians have had to spend time surrounding the Ukrainians in Kupiansk. It's a long article which I am not going to spend more time about. And of course, as I discussed in my program yesterday, General Syrskyi himself, the Ukrainian commander, gave basically a pessimistic perspective on the war, admitting that the counterattacks in Sumy region have been unsuccessful and relying upon robots to win the war for Ukraine instead. An absurd idea, which I will talk about more fully in later programs. Anyway, tomorrow, by the way, I do intend to do a more comprehensive program about the military situation. And I will also touch on a very interesting article which has been published about the Ukrainian drone industry by somebody who was deeply involved in organizing it, which has corroborated all the suspicions about the Ukrainian drone industry that I have previously had. But anyway, this is where I must end today's program. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. We'll see what the Rubio, Vance and Witkoff do to try to get this meeting with Putin organized and what kind of pushback they continue to get from the Russians. But as I said, that's me for today, and have a very good day.